What kind of crime could possibly earn a punishment so barbaric that it left the victim mangled, broken beyond recognition, and hung up for all to see like a gruesome billboard? In the Middle Ages, the answer wasn't as complex as you might think. Any act that shook the foundations of authority or defied the social order, no matter how small or large, could bring down one of the most terrifying penalties in human history, the breaking wheel. Also called Rädern in German territories, this method of execution wasn't just a death sentence, it was a performance. A public demonstration of what happened when someone dared to step outside the rigid rules of medieval life. It was designed not just to kill, but to utterly destroy. Bones were smashed. Limbs were twisted. The condemned often remained alive through the ordeal, left to suffer as a living warning. This dreadful punishment was reserved for those the state considered beyond saving: killers, bandits, rebels, and in some regions, even people accused of witchcraft or heresy. The crime didn't just need to be violent, it had to be seen as a threat to the state itself. Something that made kings, judges, or bishops feel vulnerable. The breaking wheel wasn't some rare relic, it was used widely across Europe. From the Holy Roman Empire to France to Eastern Europe, it became a symbol of state power. In France, it was officially written into law under Code Louis in 1670, though its use had already been widespread long before that. Some claim it was used as early as the 9th century under King Charles the Bald, but the most solid documentation comes from the 13th century Sachsenspiegel, a German legal code that didn't hold back. It explicitly ordered the wheel for unprovoked murderers, with chilling language: whoever kills another on the road, without cause or feud, shall be broken on the wheel. But this horror show wasn't for everyone. Medieval society was obsessed with hierarchy, and even in death, class mattered. While peasants and outcasts were ripped apart on the wheel, nobles usually got more dignified exits, beheadings with a sword or axe. Their blood may have been the same, but their deaths were considered more noble. For the poor and powerless, however, mercy was rarely an option. Records from 16th century Saxony reveal that even repeat petty offenders, people who stole multiple times or stirred fear in their village, could be sentenced to the wheel. It wasn't always about what you did, but how badly society wanted to make an example out of you. A string of thefts, repeated violent attacks, or even acts of arson committed during times of war or famine, any of these could earn someone a place on the wheel. And if the victim happened to be someone powerful or politically important, the punishment became even more brutal. Once a person was condemned to the wheel, there was no quiet execution in a dark cell. The punishment began long before the first bone was broken. The final walk started with shame, fear, and public humiliation. Stripped of any rights and all dignity, the condemned was dragged from the prison, sometimes barefoot and bloodied from earlier torture or beatings. In many cases, their clothing was torn or removed entirely, reducing them to nothing more than an object for public scorn. This was not an act of justice, it was a brutal stage play, designed to horrify. In much of the Holy Roman Empire, this march led from the prison to a raised execution platform, often located outside the city gates. These places were known as Hochgericht, or high courts, and they were chosen specifically for their visibility. The higher the scaffold, the greater the warning. Entire towns could see the punishment unfold. As the procession began, church bells would toll, not for the soul of the dying, but to summon spectators. People poured into the streets. Children, merchants, priests, and nobles all gathered to witness the spectacle. Some records from 16th century cities like Nuremberg and Frankfurt describe the scene with chilling clarity. The condemned might be forced to carry the very wheel that would break them, or a wooden cross, symbolizing both burden and defeat. Crowds lined the streets, shouting curses, throwing rotten food, or even stones. This was entertainment. Priests walked beside the doomed, holding crucifixes and urging last-minute confessions. In Catholic areas, a final blessing might be offered, but more often than not, it was too little, too late. And if the crime had truly shocked the community, if it involved the murder of a noble, a religious betrayal, or rebellion against the crown, the condemned was often tortured before even reaching the scaffold. Heated irons might be used to sear flesh, or limbs might be fractured ahead of time. According to French documents from the 1600s, such cruel extras were especially common in cases like parricide, killing one's own parents, or regicide, killing royalty. This entire sequence of agony was planned and approved in advance. Every gruesome detail was listed in an official document known as the Straffordnung, or sentencing order. It made sure the punishment not only followed the law, but also satisfied the public thirst for vengeance. By the time the condemned reached the scaffold, they were often barely conscious, staggering under pain, exhaustion, and fear. But tradition demanded one final ritual, the reading of their crimes aloud for all to hear. The executioner, called the Scharfrichter in German, would announce the offenses in front of the crowd. In some towns, a public crier would shout, "By order of the law and the emperor's justice, this man shall be broken on the wheel for his wicked deeds." Then came the final act. The prisoner was tied to the wooden wheel, arms outstretched, legs bound tightly. Their body was splayed open like a canvas of flesh about to be shattered. The wheel, soon to become the instrument of obliteration, stood ready, silent and cruel. What followed was the breaking, bone by bone. The breaking wheel was not reserved for the highborn or the powerful. In fact, it was usually the opposite. It targeted those at the bottom of society, those whose lives were considered disposable by the ruling class. Thieves, murderers, deserters, and traitors were often the ones dragged to the scaffold, bound in chains, and introduced to the wheel. But the line between crime and punishment in the medieval world was never truly clear. Sometimes, people were condemned for acts as minor as stealing bread or resisting authority, especially if they belonged to the poor or marginalized classes. In theory, the punishment was reserved for the most heinous crimes. In reality, it was also a weapon of control. Public fear wasn't just about justice, it was about obedience. The wheel was designed to terrify those watching into submission, and the choice of victim played a key role in that message. Authorities selected targets who would send the strongest warning to the masses. But the wheel didn't discriminate by gender or even by age. While men made up the majority of victims, women were not spared. In some regions, women accused of witchcraft, infanticide, or poisoning were sentenced to the wheel, though often combined with other tortures like burning or drowning. There are records of young adults, even teenagers, suffering this fate, especially during times of political unrest or moral panic. One infamous case is that of Peter Stump, a German farmer accused of being a werewolf in 1589. He was condemned not only to die on the wheel but to be tortured in a prolonged, theatrical fashion, his flesh torn with red-hot pincers, his limbs shattered, and finally his head decapitated. His daughter, accused alongside him, was also executed. Whether the charges were true or fabricated didn't matter. Once condemned, the wheel awaited. Religious and political dissidents, especially during the Reformation and periods of heresy hunting, were also victims. Anyone who threatened the established order, either by action or by belief, could find themselves tied to the wheel. In some cases, entire groups were executed in public squares to demonstrate the power of the church or the state. Even those granted a so-called mercy weren't truly spared. Sometimes, the court would allow a coup de grace, a final blow to the chest or neck meant to end the victim's suffering more quickly. But this wasn't out of kindness. It was often dependent on status, connections, or bribes. For most victims, the wheel was a slow, conscious descent into agony. And perhaps the most terrifying part, the people watching believed it was just. They believed that every scream, every bone crushed, was part of restoring order. So who were the victims of the breaking wheel? They were anyone the powerful wanted to make an example of: criminals, rebels, scapegoats. They were reminders that in the medieval world, survival wasn't just about obeying the law, it was about staying invisible, silent, and small. In theory, survival meant enduring the blows, staying conscious, and clinging to life even as every limb was splintered. And unbelievably, some people did. Historical records describe victims who stayed alive for hours, some even for days, mounted on the wheel, their mangled limbs woven through the spokes, eyes blinking in shock, unable to move but unable to die. One account from 18th century Germany details a man who survived 3 days on the wheel. He was exposed to the elements, bitten by insects, watched by townspeople, and denied water. His crime: robbery and murder. His punishment: A slow fade into death, with only pain as company. But how did the body endure such brutality? The answer lies in the brutal technique. The executioner was skilled in breaking bones while avoiding vital organs. Blood loss was minimized. Vital points were deliberately avoided until the very end, or never struck at all. This meant the heart kept beating, the brain kept thinking, the victim felt everything. Even when granted a mercy blow to the chest or neck, death was no guarantee of peace. Some blows missed their mark. Some were delayed for hours. And in many cases, mercy wasn't granted at all. It was reserved for those who had noble status, or favor with the authorities. For commoners, thieves, or the accused, mercy was a luxury they would not afford. So, could you survive the breaking wheel? Technically, yes. But survival wasn't salvation. It was an extension of the torment, a cruel gift meant to stretch punishment into something eternal.